see Bonnie, those of you that remember Bonnie, in that lovely photo. That's at the back of Davidson's. That was during a women's work session a few years ago when we had the copper going and everything. All right, so I'm going to start. Most important woman, of course, was probably Queen Victoria, and it's quite an irony when you look at the Victorian era that Victoria herself is, I mean, arguably one of the most powerful women on the planet, and it doesn't transpose down to other women. Women are still very much in domestic roles, but of course Victoria is the pinnacle of the era. Victoria herself has quite a few influences on women. This is a painting, a fairly famous painting by Hatia of her wedding to Prince Albert. And most of you probably already know this, but Victoria was very short, like about 5'2" or something. She was really minuscule. She was very concerned that people on her wedding day wouldn't recognise who the Queen was. In the procession around London, they wouldn't recognise her, so she ordered a white dress, which was quite a unique thing. She's one of the first women to have a white wedding, and it then sets the fashion trend. If you could afford it, you had a white wedding. Now, a lot of women, of course, didn't do this, because for a lot of women, your wedding dress was just your best dress and you were going to wear it after the wedding. So a white dress wasn't really appropriate. But it is the beginning of a custom that still holds to this day, that we owe to Victoria. Victoria and Albert go on to have 9 children, and both of them stressed domestic values. She'd followed a series of disreputable, really, monarchs of England. And the monarchy had lost a lot of its prestige. You know, there was a lot of bawdiness and going on, and it was almost at a bit of a turning point in whether the British monarchy would succeed or go the way of the French and the German and things. But Victoria and Albert really go to a lot of trouble to stress domestic values, the family. And there's a lot of these paintings of Victoria with all her children. There's a really early photograph there of her with the Princess Royal, Victoria, her oldest daughter. This amazing photograph here from 1857, actually showing the whole 9 children. Notice in this one, the amazing fashion of the time, if you could afford it, was to dress your children as miniature adults. Look at the poor girls with their crinolines and dressed up, you know, like miniature ladies, the boys in their kilts. Tony, you'll probably appreciate some of this early photography. Another thing that Victoria and Albert do, of course, is influence our Christmas traditions. Albert was German. When he married Victoria, there was no custom in Britain for having a Christmas tree. That's a German custom, bringing a pine tree inside and decorating it. And once their family grew, Albert started getting pine trees brought into Windsor Castle, decorated with candles. And this particular image appeared in Alan, I can't read the date on my slide because I've got people over the top, I know.
1848.
1848. I just got rid of you, yes. 1848. And Victoria was so popular that she really set trends. If she has a Christmas tree in her house at Christmas, then that was the done thing. 1848, we're looking at a couple of years before gold's discovered. So the people here from Britain on the Goldfields have seen this image. They've got used to this idea, and the idea of Christmas trees appears on the Goldfields very, very early. This sad monument is in the north of England in a place near Silkstone, and it was erected, as you can see if you're there, after a dreadful accident in a coal mine. One of the drives was flooded. The order went round. It was eerily similar to the story of the Creswick mine disaster. People underground run to the end of the drive, they're trapped, they're drowned. And the people working in this mine were children. So you'll see there, if you look at the grave, and I'm sure you're all reading the ages of the children, and notice how many of them are girls. Girls and women were paid a lot less than men, so it was much cheaper to employ girls than boys, cheaper to employ ladies than men. Victoria was particularly affected by this accident. She was shocked and demanded something be done about it. Now, she hasn't got any, like today, she hasn't really got powers to make laws, but of course she's got the ear of members of Parliament. It's not only Victoria, it's the press. People are outraged at this, and as a result, there's a Mines Act passed in 1842. The Mines Act prohibits all boys under the age of 10, which is still pretty little, isn't it, and all women and all girls from working underground. This is really significant for Ballarat because, remember, we have no children and no females working in the mines in Ballarat. Boys are allowed work when they're 11, but not, which, I mean, arguably some of you might think that's still a child, of course, but no children under the age of 10 after this. Right, so 2 years later, gold's discovered in Ballarat. I love this sketch of Mount Alexander because you'll actually notice in this sketch there isn't a single female if you go through it. And this is very, very typical. The initial rush to the goldfields is young, single, white males. Firstly coming from Melbourne, then from Geelong, and then from overseas to the goldfields. So this is really, really early. In Melbourne, it creates a problem. And William Strutt does this beautiful sketch, The Girls Left Behind. There's actually a bit of panic in Melbourne. Notice this lady here is boarding up her windows. Because so many men left, and you've all read the stories, teachers walking out of school, ministers abandoning their pulpits, shopkeepers throwing their apron on the floor and out the door, men just going off to the goldfields. That the women are suddenly going, well, who's going to protect us? And there are stories of them moving into each other's homes for protection, boarding up windows, and as Strutt notices, having to suddenly do what is an atypical role, chop the wood, get ready for the fire, something they're not used to because, of course, they're young, beautiful women. Look at this one here. Here we've got the young girls looking out the window, eagerly looking out of the window, because what can they see? Oh, it's a man. This amuses me, this almost cartoon-like. There are World War I posters of Melbourne almost imitating this. And the posters in Melbourne, or the cartoons, the girls are saying, oh, look, girls, it's a man. And in many ways, the society in 1851 has similarities to wartime society. It becomes a society where the young, fit, strong men leave. So in the war, they're going off to war. In the 1850s, they're heading to the goldfields. And the women have to adapt. The adaptation in the 1850s is not permanent, but they do have to start chopping wood. There's even women in Melbourne at Christmas in 1851, women are involved in bringing in the harvests and picking the vegetables, gathering in the food, because there is no one else. They just have to change their roles temporarily. Now we've got Gill heading off to the goldfields again. Whoops, sorry. Notice it's mostly men, but there is a woman in this one. There is a woman and a child. Can you see her? Well, she's centre there, centre screen here on the wagon. Not walking, on obvious, sort of, and not has more possessions than the man. Women typically go on my cursor's got a mind of its own. Typically rode on small carts with their possessions. Lots of stories from the diaries of women like Ellen Clacy that in the evenings on the walk to the diggings they would sleep under the wagon, as opposed to the men who've got all their worldly possessions off to the diggings in a small little red sack there. This is an interesting one. The script there says, "Oh my goodness, I'll be off," which of course is Polly, and the men are saying, "Hold on, Pol, my girl, you'll be all right." And here she is off to the diggings with her buckets and things. Notice the buckets, and Sovereign Hill is an interesting, actually shows this a little bit, and it's something you can talk to visitors about. Up until the early part of the 1800s, buckets were the wooden buckets, and we've got a few of those made around Sovereign Hill, the wooden buckets. The problem with a wooden bucket is when you fill it full of water, it's very heavy. Women enjoyed these new metal buckets that appear as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and of course are much lighter. So if you've got it full of milk or water, this for a woman would be a labour-saving device that we tend not to even think about. We look at a bucket and think, oh yes, it's a bucket. But if you have a look at the census figures, and this would be nothing surprising, from the very beginning in Victoria, even before the gold rushes, Victoria had always had more males than females. And if you think about who comes, in New South Wales, there's more convicts are males than females. The early settlers, the squatters, the males come first. So Victoria and all of Australia always had a dominance. When gold was first discovered in Victoria, there's 46,000 males in the state and 31,000 females. So there's already an imbalance. And of course, it just goes crazy. So by 1854, this is the year of Eureka, there's a huge imbalance that continues. And it actually continues for really most of the century, where there are more males than females. It probably continues all the way to the First World War. So this, of course, has an effect. One of the effects is that government officials are alarmed that there are more males than females, and that the average age of the males in the colony is about 22. So they fear lots of these young single males will get up to no good. So there becomes a push to bring in females, and one of the people heavily involved in this is Carolyn Chisholm. So you will know her story. She's been working for the rights of female immigrants ever since the times of the convict era. She continues taking an interest at the time of the gold rush. She visits Victoria, she travels around. She's particularly worried about women sleeping under wagons on the way to the goldfields and the lack of suitable accommodation. So she actually, this is just showing, she encourages female immigration. So there is supported immigration, cheap tickets for young females. And you can see here one of the ships full of young girls coming out to the goldfields. Interesting to ponder the sort of girl who would take up an offer to come out to the colonies. They're really hoping they're going to get themselves a husband. This was the whole point of it. You're coming out to the goldfields and you will find yourself a suitable husband very, very quickly, because there's all these stories of more men than women in the colonies. This is Carolyn Chisholm. This is actually a page from a scrapbook, one of her scrapbooks that she'd that has emerged, and it just shows she organised people. She did all this fundraising and she organised the building of these shelter sheds, and they were built along the roads to the diggings. So there were shelter sheds at places like Diggers Rest and I think Bacchus Marsh. And you can see here that you can actually, there's different prices for beds. So you can get a bed for $1. You can get a child's bed for 6 months. You can get some wood. So there's different prices. And I mean, it would have been, we'd think it was pretty rough, but I guess it's done sleeping under a wagon. I just love this painting. So I've put it in. To me, she's got to be Irish. She might look, and I'm just making this up because to me she looks Irish. But here we've got a girl, obviously a servant girl. She's got, look at her apron. It's not, it hasn't got any lace. It's completely practical, not white. If you think about it, it's a much more practical colour. Her dress is torn. The front of her dress is quite worn here. So you can actually see she's been working. She's taken her sleeves off. She, I would guess, probably has a pair of sleeves, but she probably only wears them to church. She probably would keep them for good. She's been working. She's got her apron on. And who knows? Claxton thinks she's dreaming of home. Maybe she's dreaming of who she's going to marry on the Goldfields. We've got another woman coming to the Goldfields, different this time. This is a married woman. And there is actually a huge number of young families that come to the Goldfields. The Australian Goldfields were quite unique in that they attracted women. A good comparison is the Californian Goldfields. The Californian Goldfields came to be known as the Wild West. They were a long way from the government on the East Coast. They were a long way from law and order. The American Indians were regarded as fierce and dangerous, rightly so, really. It was not seen as a suitable destination for women and for men to take their wives. Australia, on the other hand, was very different. We were part of the British Empire, so unlike America that had had a war and had fought and had left the Queen behind, Australia was still under the protection of the British Army, still a British colony. People saw comfort in that. It was overwhelmingly a Christian country with Christian values. The Indigenous population was not seen as a threat. In fact, a lot of people felt that the Aboriginal race was dying out, and it was inevitable that it would die out. There was a very strong belief that actually it was an inferior race that was doomed to die out, and that was part of Darwin's great plan, that it wouldn't. Also, if you think about the location of Ballarat and Bendigo, both cities, a couple of days' walk from Melbourne. No rainforest, no crocodiles, no lions, no Indians, no Alps, no deserts to cross. A young, fit, healthy woman could walk from Melbourne to Ballarat, and most of them come from Geelong. So Geelong is only a 2 or 3 day walk across relatively flat country to the Goldfields, where you're under the protection of British law. So it was seen as somewhere you could bring your wife. And in this beautiful painting here, Maddox Brown actually shows, and I've actually used this painting on one of my other talks, so some of you have probably heard all this, but he actually shows the young family together bringing a child. She's holding a little baby. Can you see the hand in the front there? Under her shawl, and they're heading to the Goldfields. They're not super wealthy. There's no top hat. They're not upper class, but they're not poor. They're not Irish escaping the potato famine. They're not convicts. They're middle class. She's got a very nice bonnet. She's got a cape. She's got an umbrella. He's got a very practical warm coat, and they're looking forward to their life on the Goldfields, leaving England. See the white cliffs of Dover there? And you can actually see this boat is actually called El Dorado, so that if you were looking at this painting in England, you would be able to read the signs and go, they're going to the Goldfields, the city of gold. They're heading to Australia. One woman who visited the Goldfields was a lady called Ellen Clacy, who left us her diaries. And in her diaries, she actually makes this really interesting comment to girls wishing to emigrate to Australia. If you possess good health, are not fastidious or fine ladylike, if you can milk cows, churn butter, cook a good damper and mix a pudding, right? But to those who cannot wait upon themselves and whose fair fingers are unused to the exertion of doing anything useful, my advice is, for your sake, remain at home. So you need to be young, you need to be fit, you need to be resourceful. You need to be able to milk your own cow and churn your own butter, because there's not the servants in Australia. The shortage of females make it really hard to get servants. The servants, bless them, keep running off and getting married. So you have to cope. But she does actually comment on the good climate and the possibilities. Here we've got a young family on the Goldfields, St. Gill, the woman. This is a little boy. As you all know, boys are dressed. It's not really like girls. Children were really just dressed the same until they were 3 or 4. And if you think about it, ladies, this is a time before disposable nappies. If you put a nappy on your child, you have to wash it. If you put a dress on your child, you don't need to put a nappy on them, do you? So common sense. But look at this picture. Imagine you're this lady here with a young husband and your young family. The Goldfields are a hazardous place. There's a huge death rate on the Goldfields. The largest death rate is amongst children. Of these children, if we were talking face to face, I would actually ask you to tell me which one you think is most vulnerable. But of course, sorry, you're all muted. This little baby here is probably not at great risk at the moment, because this little baby is being breastfed. This little baby is not eating anything. But this little chap here is in grave danger. There's no sewage on the Goldfields. There's no river in Ballarat. There's no river in Bendigo. There's no river in Castlemaine. There are small creeks. The creeks are being polluted by the mining. The creeks are being contaminated by the sewage. This little chap is drinking water. And if you take a trip over to Castlemaine, I advise you, if you haven't been to this place, and now we're allowed to travel, this is actually, it's not a lovely day's drive because it is hauntingly sad, but an interesting destination. It's on the outskirts of Castlemaine. Just head out the road as if you're heading down to Melbourne, or stick Pennyweight Flat Cemetery in your sat-nav. It's very easy to find. It's a rocky hill overlooking an area that was called Pennyweight Flat. Pennyweight is a small amount of gold, and areas that were called Pennyweight Flats were usually named that because they were not successful goldfields. People didn't find a lot of gold. The area below this hill is very low. It's very marshy. It flooded. It was particularly unhealthy. And this sad little hill is a cemetery where there are over 200 children. They were buried in, you can see the sign there, only 5 years. There is one adult grave in this cemetery, I think one, and that's all. It's almost entirely devoted to children who died, and they now think because of the stagnant water on the area below, waterborne diseases that spread, and of course things like cholera and typhoid, really contagious. and I mean, would have affected men, but would have had a really devastating impact on women, young women coming to the goldfield. You come for a better life. You come for a better life for your children. You don't expect to have to bury them. And the really sad thing about this cemetery is that there's hardly any tombstones. These people obviously had no money. See all these little piles of rocks in the ground in the forest around here? They're all graves where families have just gathered up rocks that they've been able to find to put on the graves. Really sad. Right. So what are women doing on the goldfields? Some are helping dig, and there are stories of diggeresses and accounts. There's places around Ballarat. There's a Petticoat Gully. There's a Dolly's Lane. There's areas named where women were working, but that was unusual. Women tended to stay in their traditionally roles, and the traditional role of women was carers and, of course, providing food. So lots of women very quickly realise all these diggers have got no cooking skills. They're hungry. You can make money. You can cook up a big stew, bring your own plate, bring your own cup, and a shilling for a stew. This one is a really amusing painting. If you look closely at what Gil's done here, can you see this family's been on their way to the diggings and the wagon has broken? Can you see? The wheel's fallen off. So, oh dear, what are we going to do now? Never mind. We'll put up the tent. We'll head up to the local squatter. We'll get ourselves a sheep, and the squatter will sell us an old sheep. He's very glad to get rid of all his old mutton. And we're putting on the side of the road, as the diggers are heading off to the diggers, a breakfast. And she would be doing quite well. She would be making quite a bit of money. People would stop. Notice here, a little bit of a hint that we're not just having meat for breakfast, but predominantly meat. This is another real one where this time he's not even subtle about it. This time he's recognising that what was well known was when men stopped for their meat, or their coffee, a lot of them wanted something a bit more substantial, and a lot of these coffee shops were sly grogged huts. Sovereign Hill has used this image to create one of these down on our diggings, and it's sometimes activated. Some of you might have been activating this one, and I love this one where she's, round the back, she's hiding. You had to be a bit careful. This was against the law. You were only allowed to sell alcohol in registered hotels, and hotels were not allowed to be on the diggings. The fine for selling illegal alcohol was £10, and the tent and all your belongings were set on fire and destroyed. There are hardly any records of the women running these coffee tents being fined. There's a couple. There's the one in Ballarat where that Irish girl, the tent was burnt with the baby in it. But there's hardly any stories. There's lots of stories of troopers making a lot of money. So from that, we assume that you're going to be fined £10 if you're caught selling grog. If the troopers come past and you offer them maybe 8, maybe 5, the trooper's going to get half the fine. If you offered him 6, he's probably not going to arrest you. And clearly that was what was happening. But women on the goldfields were a huge boon in many ways, and one of the biggest things was the health of miners who had a wife was much better. Women kept houses dry, they kept houses clean, and they bought vegetables. The men going to the goldfields, a lot of them were living on mutton and damper. If you live on mutton and damper for a year, you're going to get scurvy. You're not going to be hungry. The mutton's cheap, but it's not a balanced diet. A woman would never serve up a meal of just meat. A woman's been taught to how to prepare a decent meal, a woman has been taught that the most important thing you can be in your life is a good housewife. You are proud of your domestic skills. When the women leave England, think back to the young couple on the sailing ship. The man might have packed some mining tools. The woman, what's she packed in her trunk? She's bought vegetable seeds. Some women bought little fruit trees in little hessian sacks, like pot plants. They nurtured them, they watered them with their limited water supplies on the ships. They carried them to the Goldfields. As soon as they arrive in Melbourne, women are thinking, right, I'm heading out in the bush, I'm heading to the Goldfields. I don't know what's going to be there. I need milk, I need veggies, so I've got my seeds, and I need eggs. So they would buy themselves some chickens. Some women might buy a cow, but a cow's expensive. You have to feed a cow. A cow needs grass, a cow needs fodder. A goat is a much better option. It'll eat anything. You have to get this goat to the diggings. You have to lead it. Much easier to lead a goat than a cow. So a lot of women arrive at the Goldfields, they're leading a goat, there's a goat tied on the side of the cart, they've got baskets with chickens. Those chickens, which are Sovereign Hills chickens, there were Sussex chickens in the 1850s, but on the Goldfields, most of the chickens were bantams, what we would call bantams. They were much smaller. So they'd fit in a basket. I guess you can put a Sussex in a basket, if a big enough basket, and they come. So the other advantage of having a wife is that when you finish mining and you get back to your tent or hut and your clothes are wet, you've got someone at home who's got the bed dry, who's got the fire going, and who's able to wash and dry your clothes and have spare clothes for the next day. Something not totally relating to women, but just fascinating. The sort of food available on the Goldfields, there actually was canned food. There was canned food from 1812. The first canned food comes about as a result of Napoleon. An army marches on his stomach, demanding that they discover a way of preserving food so they can carry, the armies can carry it. Right. So by 1812, it's available in sealed cans. The cans are tin and they are welded shut, sometimes with a bit of lead involved, but we won't go there. Right. By 1818, you can actually get a veal and carrot stew available in a tin. It's expensive. Most people wouldn't even look at it. But of course, if you're heading to the Goldfields, it's useful. You could also get sardines in tins. Now, what's interesting is that these tins were sealed shut, so sort of soldered, I think, not welded, wouldn't it be? How do you open them? The instructions on the first tinned food actually said, use your bayonet to cut into the can. So people had to really attack them with a big knife. There are several people like Howard who talk about the roads to the diggings. As you're walking to the diggings, the sides of the roads littered with empty sardine cans. So people were carrying canned fish, cutting them open and eating them, and just like we do today, throwing the tins into the bush. The first can opener, really interesting, doesn't appear until 1858. It's a sort of one of those knife things, hook things that some of you will remember that you used to always end up cutting your thumb nearly off when you used them. They were only available in the shops. The shopkeepers had them chained to the counters, and when you bought your tin of food, if you wanted to, the shopkeeper would open the tin for you in the shop. So that defeats the purpose a bit of it. It's 1866 before that roll key top appears on sardine tins, and it's 1870 before the first tin opener that we would recognise appears and that you could actually buy and take home to use. So that's just a little side thing. Because it was food, I thought that's a little bit to do with women. Think about the dangers on the goldfields. I mean, dangers of mining were men, but huge dangers of women. I was watching something the other night, and one of those quiz shows on telly, and the question was, what animal kills the most people in Australia last year? And the answer was the horse, not the sharks. Horses in the 1850s killed a bigger percentage of the population than cars do today. Horses were dangerous. People fell off wagons, they got kicked by horses, they got run over by horses. And here you'll see a woman and her children fleeing as the mail arrives from Geelong. Wouldn't it be great? No, it wouldn't be great. Racing down Main Street. Note the state of the street. Look at the rubbish everywhere. Look at the animals everywhere. Look at the mud, the potholes, and of course the coach racing into town bringing the mail. I want to look at a little bit about the Industrial Revolution that is changing the world. So it's revolutionising the world. It's introducing trains, it's introducing spinning machines, it's revolutionising the cotton industry, all sorts of things. And how does this affect women? A very subtle way is the development of cast iron stoves. Think about the kitchens at Sovereign Hill. Every kitchen except Davidson's is at ground level. The biggest killer of women in the 1850s was childbirth, hands down. Lots of women sadly die in childbirth. The second biggest killer of women was cooking. You can die cooking because if your fire is at ground level and you're wearing a long skirt, you can catch fire and burn, probably not burn to death, but die as a result of infected burns. So the stove in Davidson's is a huge safety thing. The chimney cranes that are all around Sovereign Hill, and that's a chimney crane on the left there, the point of those is to bring your, whatever, your pot away from the fire so that you're not dangling your skirt. So they're also a health device, health and safety on the goldfield. Industrial Revolution doesn't affect the laundry very much. The laundry, probably for most women, it doesn't improve until after the Second World War. One slight development is that appears in the 1850s, towards the end of the 1850s, is the Mrs. Potts irons. So in the early 1850s, you've got these flat irons, all different sizes, all different weights. Most women would have 3 or 5 of these, of all different weights, small ones up to big ones. Mrs. Potts develops an iron where you just put the bottom part on your stove to heat. It's got a handle that clips on, that's not in this photo, and your bottom parts are all different weights. It's a little bit of an improvement. It's still hard work. It's still on a fire. It's still, if you haven't got a servant, it's jolly hard work. So I have trouble quantifying this, but one of the great things that comes out of the Industrial Revolution is the huge potteries, you know, the Coalbrook Dell and Stoke-on-Trent and all the beautiful potteries of England. Suddenly, China becomes a lot cheaper. The prints on these are like decals that are stuck on. It's mass produced. Suddenly, you can afford a beautiful tea set. The Industrial Revolution signals the rise of the middle class. Women want to have stuff. They want to have nice things. They're very proud of their beautiful things. In the kitchen, you display your china. You have your kitchen dresser with all your beautiful things on display. The willow pattern is a really popular design. The willow pattern doesn't come from China. It's influenced by the tea trade with China and the exotic East. So it's an incredibly popular pattern of the time. Now, I can never work out how having beautiful things improves your life, but I guess it improves your mental your mental state and having a nice home and a nice teacup and things. Something to think about. Here we've got your typical lady. Gil showing exactly how women should be. Nice and calm at home, calmly reading while dad's resting and mum's. This lady almost certainly has a servant in the kitchen preparing dinner. So if you've got servants, a lot of ladies would have an upstairs maid and a downstairs maid. Now, of course, on the diggings, that becomes a nonsense. But your upstairs maid looks after the bedrooms and your downstairs maid looks after the kitchen. And if you're really posh, you would have a laundry maid as well, looking after the laundry. Now, let's look at the fashions. For women, of course, the fashions are restrictive. They're huge, they're heavy, they're beautiful. They also label you. They really, you know, you walk down Sturt Street today and you don't go, oh, there's a rich person. You walk down Main Street in the 1850s and you would have gone, oh, there's a rich lady. Look at this beautiful, beautiful dress. And I love this one because you can really see the detachable collar, which goes all the way down to the front of the dress, and the detachable sleeves, because of course you're never going to wash your dress. You'd ruin it washing it. Another thing of interest, I actually spent a bit of time in the Costume Museum at Bath talking to people a few years ago. None of these dresses were one piece. This part here was a series of hook and eyes. They were all skirts and tops. And the ladies were talking about how, because the dress is so hard to make and it's so expensive, it was separate so that you could mix and match a bit, you could change it. The top part would wear out quicker than the bottom part, and was different. Whereas because we have the advantage of modern fabrics and machines, we tend to stitch them together into one frock. Here's some more. This is just me being fantasising at some of these beautiful, beautiful pictures. I love the fact that ladies, during the day, you're not allowed to show any skin except your hands and your face. But at night, of course, you can show your arms and your beautiful neck. Notice the ears. Ears were erotic in the 1850s. A lady did not show her ears. They were cheeky. They were thought to incite the passion of young men. So the hairstyles were made to cover the ears. Another beautiful dress. Here's me just being. Of course, something that we don't wear, thank goodness, and that altered women's shapes was that women were wearing these corsets. They started wearing these at a really young age. I have actually seen a pattern, I should have put it on here, for an 8-year-old girl's corset. What a scary thought. Women were put into these and they deformed. They actually deformed their rib cages. They were pulled in. The smaller your rib, your waist, the more beautiful you were, and it went under your dress. Bras don't exist. You don't need a bra because the corset is all in one. So it pulls you in at the middle and it pushes you out attractively at the top. So that you really do have a different shape. Women also stood a little bit differently. Can you see the corset actually, if you look at these people, pushed you into a sort of a forward, so that your front was sort of protruding and your bottom tended to stick out. If you look at early photos, of course the mannequins won't show you them, you'll notice that women actually have a different look. You can actually tell a woman who's wearing a corset. I'm not advocating corsets at Sovereign Hill. The Goldfields, things are a little bit more relaxed than Britain. The fashions are still following Britain slavishly, but the girls do seem to be having rather a good time for respectable young ladies here. And the other thing that women on the Goldfield tended to do, if you look at this Bongarade, 1854, women aren't stupid. The Goldfields were filthy. They were knee-deep in slush. And both Gill and Von Gerard, if you look at their paintings, you'll notice that the women have shortened their skirts. These girls have got them up out of the ground. They've got these lovely cloth bonnets that are very, very popular through country areas in England. A sign of beauty is a pale skin. You go to extraordinary lengths to keep the sun off your skin. These bonnets, the brim, I've lost the cursor again. The brim will, here we go. This part here you can actually fold out to make quite a protective, to keep the sun off you. All the sun off your neck, completely sheltered. I've even seen images where women put a big scarf of muslin or some fine material right over the top to really protect them if they're outside, say, gathering potatoes or tending to their veggies, where they had to work in the sun, but they're still desperately trying to keep their skin pale and beautiful. This is probably the greatest thing to influence women's lives that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. Up until 1851, there are no sewing machines. Everything is handmade, everything. And in the family, the sewing, of course, is done by the women. The sewing machine revolutionises it. Together, I guess, with the spinning and weaving machines in Britain, mass producing cotton. So the cotton coming out of Manchester becomes cheaper. So your fabric becomes cheaper. After 1851, you have possibly a sewing machine, and sales of these go through the roof. Takes till about 1858 for them really to take off and to become a bit more widespread. There's a huge factory built in Glasgow, in Scotland. They're mass produced and they become ubiquitous. You know, every woman has a sewing machine at home and sews madly. There is, in the Criterion store, there is actually a machine. It's not quite this one, but it nearly is. When you go in there, the girls, for some reason, tend to move it about a bit. I don't know why they do that. I think it's the most amazing thing almost in the whole shop and should really be highlighted. In 1858, in Ballarat, the Criterion store, so Mr. Jones from the Criterion store, had on display in the window in Main Street, Ballarat, the first sewing machine ever sold in Australia. Now, sometimes it is put on display in the window of the Cry store, but sometimes it disappears into the shop and you do have to ask where it is. I always make a point of, if I'm in there with visitors, of pointing it out and talking about it, because for women, this would have been an unbelievable. Imagine, ladies, if we had to make our costumes by hand. How many dresses would you have? You know, how many trousers has your husband got? How many shirts has your husband got? You've made everything by hand. Right. So a couple of, I'm running out of time. I talk too much. An interesting woman on the Goldfields was Martha Clendenning. Some of you would have heard of Martha Clendenning. She's married to a doctor. They arrive in Australia and the doctor has his brother and the brother's wife. So there are 2 young men and 2 women. Martha has no children, but her sister-in-law has a baby. They stay in Melbourne. The men decide they're going to head to the Goldfields and the women are going to stay in Melbourne. Martha says, no, we're not. We're coming with you. So they head off. They walk. She walks all the way. She's young, she's fit, she's strong. She walks to the Goldfields with her sister-in-law. They take turns caring for the one little baby. When they arrive on the Goldfields, the 2 men head off to look for gold, and Martha and her sister are sharing a very large, what she calls a large tent, and they have nothing to do. They're bored. There's no housework. Doesn't take long to clean up a tent and get the food ready, and there's 2 of them. So she says she decides she will open a store in the front part of the tent. She notices all the young women on the goldfield. She notices the trouble they're having getting babies' clothes. She specialises in selling babies' clothes. So she organises people to make, other women to make, and she sells babies' clothes. Martha claims in her diaries she was the only store on the goldfields not selling illegal alcohol. Now, whether that's true or not, but certainly it's an interesting perspective. What is interesting about Martha is that she represents this time when the goldfields are an aberration. It's not a normal time. People are not living a normal life. They're in tents, they're out in the bush, there's no old people, they're all young, they're all enthusiastic. Martha comes to Ballarat and has no qualms about becoming a shopkeeper, having a business. But within a year or 2, her husband decides this looking for gold is no good. It's hard work. I'm not finding any. I'm a trained doctor. I'm going to go back to becoming a doctor. He sets himself up as a doctor. They build a little cottage, and Martha says, I resume my normal life as a housewife and more becoming. She closes the shop and goes back to becoming what your respected middle class. And this is what tends to happen. For a few years, you get lots of girls on the goldfields not acting like your typical 1850s woman, but very quickly they revert back to what's expected of them. Here's just a few of my favourite women of the goldfields. These are the girls, ladies, who sewed the Eureka flag. Phoebe Scobie, who marries Scobie's brother. This was Phoebe Emerson. She had a store on the Eureka where the stockade was. She hid George Scobie in her store. George is James's brother, the guy that's murdered, Scotty. And so she's one of the women of Eureka. Another influential woman, not on the goldfields, but certainly influential in terms of medicine, is Florence Nightingale, whose big claim to fame is, oh gosh, she'd go to mill today, wouldn't she? Let's wash everything. Let's be clean. Let's wash our hands, everybody. Hello, the men aren't getting as sick. The other one who's been a little bit lost from history and who probably had a greater influence in the Crimean War than Florence was Mary Seacole, who also had the same idea, was a very talented nurse, but notice was from Jamaica, and because of her race was not accepted. Florence Nightingale is upper class, aristocratic, white, beautiful. She's a friend of the Queen. She becomes a beloved figure. Mary Seacole has almost disappeared from history. A lot efforts to revive her memory now, but for a long time was overlooked. Isabella Beaton, who of course came the household Bible. Everybody had her book of household management. And the last thing I haven't mentioned at all is the other women on the goldfields, the entertainers and the women that nobody talked about, who left no diaries, the women that Ellen Clacy called fallen angels, who Ellen in her diary actually said, I saw one of the fallen angels walking down, I think she might have been in York Street, and I crossed the street lest her shadow should fall on me. And on that note, I think I might